Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the disgraceful behavior of the Attorney General of the United States in her appearance today at an oversight hearing before the House Judiciary Committee, at which she constantly referred to a binder full of opposition research barbs prepared to attack Democratic members instead of answering their questions, in a performance designed to please an audience of one, Donald Trump. Joining us is Adam Klasfeld, Editor-in-Chief at All Rise News, a Senior Journalism Fellow at Just Security. He has served as a legal contributor for MSNBC's The Last Word and as a Senior Legal Correspondent for The Messenger, the Managing Editor of Law and Crime, and a reporter for Courthouse News. He was prominently featured in the documentary Who is Ghislaine Maxwell, which premiered on the Stars Network and the UK's Channel 4, discussing Jeffrey Epstein's thwarted prosecution. Then we'll analyse the SAVE Act that Trump and the Republicans are trying to push through to rig the next election, which addresses the non-existent problem of voter fraud by disenfranchising 21 million Americans who don't have copies of their birth certificate, half of the country that doesn't have passports, and millions of married American women who have changed their names. Joining us is David Daley, the author of Anti-Democratic: Inside the Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, as well as the national bestseller Rat Eft, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for kickstarting the national movement to reform redistricting. He's the former editor-in-chief of Salon, and his journalism appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Atlantic, among other publications. Then finally, as a reactionary and greedy oligarchy led by the grifter-in-chief, which already controls the Supreme Court, has bought the Republican Party wholesale and is in the process of buying the media, we'll speak with Charles Derber, a professor of sociology at Boston College. A lifelong social justice activist, his work focuses on the crises of capitalism, globalization, corporate power, militarism, the culture of hegemony, the climate crisis, and peace and global justice movements. His recent books include Turnout, Mobilizing Voters in an Emergency, Dying for Capitalism, How Big Money Fuels Extinction and What We Can Do About It, How We Win, Energizing Strategies, Voters and Agendas, and Bonfire American Sociocide, Broken Relations, and the Quest for Democracy. We'll discuss his latest book, just out, Fighting Oligarchy: How Positive Populism Can Reclaim America. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Adam Klasfeld, who is Editor-in-Chief at All Rise News. He was prominently featured in the documentary Who is Ghislaine Maxwell, which premiered on the Stars Network and UK's Channel 4, discussing Jeffrey Epstein's thwarted prosecution. Welcome to Background Briefing, Adam Klasfeld.
Great to be here, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And have you ever seen anything quite as disgraceful as Pam Bondi's performance today before the House Judiciary Committee in questioning? She, of course, called the ranking member of the committee, Democrat Jamie Raskin, a washed-up loser lawyer. She refused to talk to the victims of Epstein who were sitting behind her, and she said she wouldn't get into the gutter with this woman, which is, an amazing insult given what these victims have gone through. But I guess the most dramatic moment was when a Democrat, Becca Balint, was questioning her. Bondi accused her of being part of the anti-Semitic culture right now, and Balint erupted, shouting, "Do you want to go there? Are you serious?" And then she got up and stormed out, saying to Bondi, "Talking about anti-Semitism to a woman who lost her grandfather in the Holocaust? Really?" I mean, my God, it's just so disgusting. What?
Right. It was a vile performance, Ian. There was another exchange between Attorney General Bondi and Congresswoman Balint, which was very telling in and of itself right before that, where Balint reminded her of the oversight proceedings. "This is not a game, Secretary." Bondi responded, "I'm Attorney General," and Balint quipped back, "Apologies, I couldn't tell." But she could be forgiven for not being able to tell, because usually in an oversight hearing, there is oversight done. The Attorney General of the United States isn't there to read through a binder of opposition research to cut attack ads to representatives of the party out of power. It'll be hard to remind future generations that in prior administrations, an attorney general was a nonpartisan representative who was the highest law enforcement official in the land, and they were expected to be nonpartisan. They were expected to be above the fray because they have the power to put you in jail. They aren't the president's attack dog. But of course, during Trump 2.0, she absolutely perceives herself as that and acts as that. And of course, we are having this so-called oversight hearing the day before one of her political prosecutions failed, where she, through Jeanine Pirro, the former Fox pundit turned U.S. attorney for the District of D.C., tried to put 6 Democratic lawmakers in prison because they accurately recited the Uniform Code of Military Justice and reminded people in the military and the intelligence community that, yes, you have the right and the obligation to refuse illegal orders. And they tried to gin up a federal case out of that, and a grand jury said no, because they knew the law, they knew the First Amendment, they knew the Constitution. And that's she can't answer questions about that. And so what we're seeing, instead of oversight into in flagrant corruption of what the Justice Department has become under Pam Bondi and Trump 2.0, which is light years beyond anything that happened during Trump 1.0, we're getting this performance of Pam Bondi sitting at the witness table, literally with a binder full of opposition research, to attack the Congress people questioning her if they have a D next to their title.
Well, I guess the corruption there goes back when she was Attorney General of Florida. She, along with, I believe, the Attorney Generals in New York and other states, were looking into the Trump Foundation, its corruption, and Trump University. And she was about to rule, as the others had done, against Trump and Trump University. But then she accepted, I think it was a $40,000 or $50,000 donation from Trump, and dropped the charges. And I guess that's how they bonded, right?
Right. I mean, it's an origin story. That big pay-to-play scandal of old feels quaint. We talk about $50,000. We could be talking about the border czar, who is now responsible for the supposed drawdown in the Twin Cities that never came. But look, I mean, we have right now the Department of Justice in the hands of Trump's former attorneys. Pam Bondi herself was Donald Trump's defense attorney during the first impeachment. You have her deputy, Todd Blanche, the person who gave Ghislaine Maxwell that platform to speak without any pushback about her trying to distance herself and the people close to her from her crimes. Todd Blanche was Trump's criminal defense attorney. I covered Trump's criminal trial in New York and saw Todd Blanche in action. Now we're seeing him in action as a deputy attorney general to be close to his associates, to go after his opponents. You have John Sauer, the Solicitor General, the same person who was Trump's attorney at the Supreme Court in a private capacity during Trump versus United States, the immunity decision, is now the person who argues with him for him in the Supreme Court in the official capacity for the United States of America. So we're seeing this pattern of no daylight whatsoever between Donald Trump and the arm of the government, the agency, the branch of the government that has the power to put people in prison, and being stopped from doing that only because of the integrity of grand jurors, because of the integrity of judges, and the integrity of the personnel, the career personnel in the Department of Justice, who they're rapidly hollowing out, the U.S. attorneys who are being forced to resign, and the career officials, line prosecutors who won't sign off to these vendettas and schemes.
Well, I guess in terms of the testimony today, or the questioning from the Democrats, Bondi was solicitous and friendly and nice to all the Republicans, but was just absolutely venomous towards Democrats. As you say, she had a binder full of opposition research, little barbs that she issued forth. But I thought the Democrat, Jesus Garcia of Illinois, was probably one of the more effective Democrats. He said quite bluntly that Bondi is one of the worst attorney generals in our history. He called her corrupt. He said the MAGA base despises you because of your handling of the Epstein files. And then he called on her to resign immediately and ask no questions of her and cut off his allotted time. And that was it. So what did you make of that?
It's unfortunate that that is the effective way to talk here, because you cannot expect anyone to answer any question, or you can't expect Pam Bondi anymore to answer a question. You use your time to say your piece. I will say that Representative Jayapal early on in the hearing, I thought did a very good job of setting up the point of the human stakes of the Epstein files that we're all talking about, and the fact that so many people's names were released. Representative Raskin made this point as well, that the real harm that survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, who by their choice decided not to go public, were dragged out into the open with their names, sometimes their phone numbers, sometimes their photographs. They had not told their family members that they were trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein. And Representative Jayapal invited Pam Bondi to apologize to the survivors who were in the audience, who stood up. She asked how many of them never had the opportunity to meet with the Justice Department. Their hands shot up in the air. And what we saw is Pam Bondi counterattacking, saying, I don't want to get in the gutter with you. I preferred a time when we had a well-crafted question actually performing oversight and saying one's piece, as some of the Congress members did. That can be important when you have a very recalcitrant witness who sees herself as being there to throw out political attack barbs. But there's something lost when that is the best you can hope for. When asking a question to perform oversight, to get information, is just not on the table anymore.
Well, I guess her performance, of course, was for an audience of one, for Donald Trump. And I guess you could say that Donald Trump has finally found his Roy Cohn, since he was so disappointed with his first attorney general in the first term, Jeff Sessions, where he apparently was cried out loud, "Where's my Roy Cohn?"
Right.
So this time around, of course, you got a Roy Cohn in a dress. Not that Roy Cohn may have worn dresses on certain occasions,
Right.
but perhaps
right.
perhaps hanging out with J. Edgar Hoover wearing a feather boa. But in any case, what do you make of the notion that this is all about performing for Trump? The same thing, by the way, with the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard. She was kind of being shunned by him because she's completely useless. So she then gets involved and goes down to Georgia and gets involved in seizing all of the ballots, based upon, by the way, Adam, a conspiracy theorist who Trump has embraced, who came up with this notion that somehow the proof of foreign interference, perhaps from Venezuela, are in those ballots, the 2020 ballots in Fulton County, which the FBI then seized. This same guy that inspired this FBI raid and the appearance and performance of Tulsi Gabbard down there in Fulton County, his background is that he got arrested for putting hidden cameras in his bathroom, filming people using his bathroom. So you're not exactly got the A-team here in terms of the intellectual underpinning of these cases that they're bringing forth.
Absolutely. There's been an absolute rogues gallery of conspiracy theorists operating inside the government. As a matter of fact, at one point during this hearing, you had Representative Joe Neguse from Colorado making the point of the fact that Bondi had claimed you touch a finger on federal law enforcement, you're going to be in trouble. Well, he played a clip from January 6th of one of the rioters clamoring about killing cops. Well, that person is working inside the Justice Department, and she confirmed it openly. She didn't look actually troubled by that revelation, just bothered that he asked the question, but that's par for course inside the Justice Department and inside the government. We learned yesterday, you'd mentioned, Ian, with the raid on Fulton County, from the unsealing of the affidavit, we find out that the investigation was started by big lie lawyer Kurt Olson, one of the primary people who wrote the complaint to the Supreme Court on behalf of the state of Texas to try to overturn the vote, nullify the vote of 4 other states. He was calling Trump on January 6, 2021. He's the guy who's behind this particular raid, and some of the kooky conspiracy theorists, one of whom you had mentioned, and his colorful criminal record. At the same time as that, the same day, we find out the unsealing of this affidavit in Fulton County. A federal judge in Michigan slaps down another attempt by a different conspiracy theorist, big lie lawyer, Harmeet Dillon, who's now the head of the Civil Rights Division. The Orwellian nomenclature doesn't cease. But her new job, big lie lawyer Harmeet Dillon, is to, as the head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, try to seize voter data through lawsuits in dozens of states across the country. 3 times so far in a row, and there's been no adjudication the other way, she's lost. And so it's not just a conspiracy theorist here, a conspiracy theorist there. It's the entire big lie operating within the government in senior places.
So in the last couple of minutes, Adam, let's talk about, since you featured prominently in the documentary, Who is Ghislaine Maxwell? Where do you think this is in terms of this thwarted prosecution of Maxwell and Epstein, or the late Epstein, in the sense that Ro Khanna has been saying that what troubles him most is that the first thing that happened was that the FBI scrubbed all of these files. So we don't know what the baseline of the files are. And then the DOJ put on about 500 people to go through and redact stuff. But do we know what the baseline is? What are these 3 million files? When the FBI came in, did they shred or destroy files that were incriminating in terms of Trump? Because that was their mission, obviously, to get Trump out of it. And now we're learning from the few Congress people that were able to look at the full files that are unredacted. They only had 2 hours to look at 3 million files, so they didn't get very far. But apparently they found Trump's name redacted on numerous occasions. So what's the baseline? What are we dealing with here? Has Trump already rigged the game in the sense that he's been able to cover up so much of, particularly the most incriminating stuff, that could really hurt him?
I don't want to be too defeatist about it because there have been some very powerful revelations that have come out already. They have sparked investigations from Lithuania to the UK, where we've already seen some accountability happen in other countries. Would that it would happen in the United States as well? What we have found, one of the most really interesting revelations that was immediately seized upon by Trump's supporters as some sort of big coup on his behalf, this big exoneration, is an FBI interview with a former police chief who was instrumental in taking down Jeffrey Epstein, Michael Reiter, the Palm Beach County police chief. And apparently, when the investigation first went public in 2006, Trump went to him and essentially said everyone knew what Epstein was up to and that Maxwell was his operative. And look into her, she is evil. And everyone said, wow, well, here's Trump really renouncing this guy in 2006 after the investigation is public, calling him a whistleblower. Well, a whistleblower comes up before the investigation is public. And this was a very disturbing document to me because what does Trump say after Maxwell is indicted during his first term? I wish her well. Why was he wishing her well when in 2006 he was saying she is evil? And why is he bending over backwards to his former personal attorney, Todd Blanche, to give her a platform to spout whatever she wants to say without any sort of challenge? Why does she even need to try to plead the fifth? Because she doesn't have a friendly audience. She has a friendly audience with Todd Blanche, unlike Congress. And what we're seeing here is him bending over backwards to apparently do these favors for this woman who in 2006 he called evil. So yes, there's much more to be seen from these Epstein files, and the fight for transparency isn't over. But I think folks should really appreciate just what has come to light already that has sparked investigations globally and perhaps in some future time in the United States as well.
So just in closing, though, Adam, do you think that Trump would go so far as to pardon her to try and cover it up? That would be a very, very rash step, but he's kind of desperate, so not out of the question.
Right. I have been unable to predict anything that Trump will do, but I would never underestimate his shamelessness. He has his list of questionable pardons and disgraceful pardons, frankly, run long. He pardoned every single January 6th rioter. He has pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of drug trafficking and cozying up to El Chapo. He is pardoning crypto criminals that he thinks might be helpful for his own cryptocurrency business. So would I put it beyond him to give Ghislaine Maxwell the clemency that she is clamoring for in exchange for her attorney's open offer to exonerate him? I wouldn't put it beyond Trump.
Well, Adam Klasfeld, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
And again, I'll be speaking with Adam Klasfeld, who's editor-in-chief of All Rise News, a senior journalism fellow at Just Security. He has served as a legal contributor to MSNBC's The Last Word and was the senior legal correspondent for The Messenger, the managing editor of Law and Crime, and a reporter for Courthouse News. He is prominently featured in the documentary Who is Ghislaine Maxwell, which premiered on the Stars Network and on UK's Channel 4, discussing Jeffrey Epstein's thwarted prosecution. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back analyzing the SAVE Act that Trump and the Republicans are trying to push through to rig the next election.
On this side of the law, on that side of the law. Who is right, who is wrong, who is for and who's against the law? Well, you see, I didn't really mean you any harm, but I simply couldn't make it on the farm. When the land won't give a lot, you gotta do with what you got.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, David Daley, the author of Anti-Democratic: Inside the Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, as well as the national bestseller Rat Eft: Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for kickstarting the national movement to reform redistricting. He's the former editor-in-chief of Salon, and his journalism appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Atlantic, among other publications. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Daley.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Trump and the Republicans are trying to push this bill, the SAVE Act, and they've done it before, but they're doing it again with a lot of backing. Elon Musk is making a huge push behind it. And it seems sort of reasonable on the surface, but it's all about dealing with a non-existent problem, which is voter fraud, which Trump has blown up into a real issue. But ironically, he's the greatest voter fraudster in American history, or perhaps even world history. So how can the Democrats get around the fact that it seems reasonable, but it's really all about disenfranchising Democratic voters? And we're talking about 21 million people who would lack the access to documents like birth certificates, half of Americans who don't have passports, and millions of married women who have changed their names. All of those would be disenfranchised or unable to vote in the next election if this gets passed, and it's clearly designed exactly to do that.
Yeah, I think you've laid it out exactly right. This is really a show your papers bill. And the right to vote in this country is a constitutionally assured fundamental right of being an American. And this puts very many onerous barriers between citizens and the ballot box. If you have to show a passport or a birth certificate to register to vote, well, that puts a serious blockade between a lot of people and the ballot box. As you mentioned, 21 million Americans lack a passport or a birth certificate, right? That's 9%. Half of all Americans don't have a passport. 69 million women whose married names do not match the name on their birth certificate or on their passport. That's an awful lot of people that are going to be put through a really costly and time-consuming process. This would really affect people out west who are trying to register to vote in some of these massive counties where there might be a single driver's license office. The Center for American Politics did a study on this, and they said the average commute that a new voter would have to do in some of the largest counties in America would be 4.5 hours of driving a round trip in order to register to vote. For some people, it might be as much as 8 hours. This is a lot of unnecessary nonsense. This is all about trying to feed a narrative of voter fraud when voter fraud doesn't actually exist in this country. It's trying to claim that we have a non-citizen voting problem when we do not have a non-citizen voting problem. Every single study shows that any number of non-citizens voting, which is already, by the way, against the law, punishable with fines, with imprisonment, with deportation. Whenever these states do a survey or an audit and try to figure this out, in a state like Georgia, 8.2 million voters in 2024 suspected that there were 20 possible non-citizen voters. Suspected, right? In North Carolina, out of 7.7 million, 9 possibly suspected. We are talking about infinitesimal percentages with so many zeros in front of them that to be going through this process with this bill, it is a problem, um, that simply doesn't exist.
So next door in Mexico, they have a voting ID system that everybody, I believe when you turn 18, I'm not sure of what the voting age is in Mexico, but I believe whenever you're eligible to vote, you get this national ID card, and it means that you can vote anywhere in the country. And I'm astounded that you can't have something similar in this country, but I'm not really, because the whole history of voting in this country is all about restricting the vote, going back to the founding fathers who had what the Greeks called a timocracy, where initially they only wanted white men of property to be able to vote. So, we're the only country in the world that has all these impediments, like having to register and all of this, and each state has a different set of rules. Is there any way, I know after the 9/11 attacks on the United States, there was some talk about, well, there's so many people in the country we don't even know about, and because these hijackers came in and had phony IDs, etc. There was some talk about a national ID card. I know it sounds like, as you just said, the Gestapo, show me your papers. But isn't there a way to get rid of this problem? We all have to have IDs. You've got your driver's license and stuff. Why can't there be an ID that the minute you turn 18 in this country, you are automatically registered to vote? No questions asked, and that's the end of this nonsense.
Sounds like a great idea. That would solve the problem, right? The trouble is there are people working on these bills who don't want to solve the problem. They want to create new problems, and they want to put barriers to vote in front of certain people. They want to put barriers to vote in front of young people, in front of Black voters, in front of Latino voters, in front of Native American voters, right? And so we could have a national ID. We simply don't. And I imagine that if we agreed that everybody was to get a national ID card, you would probably see some of the opposition to this, fade away. The trouble here is that these bills are not asking for ID that shows and proves who you are. They're looking for specific forms of ID that they know specific people do not have. So they are specifically disallowing student IDs, even those student IDs that are issued by public state universities in those states. That would seem to me to be a viable form of identification. But if, for example, you are a political party that does not want young people voting in that state, well, this is one way to make it really difficult, because the student's passport and birth certificate are probably at home in whatever state their parents live in. When you look at what this requires from Native Americans, the specific form of ID, they will accept a tribal ID if it has an expiration date. Well, the one thing that tribal IDs do not have is an expiration date. So this is quite intentional. This is quite specific. And the people who are crafting this legislation know what they are doing. This is not about having voters prove who they are. It is about making it more difficult for specific kinds of voters to cast a ballot.
So are the Democrats going to make this case, though? Because, as I say, the Republicans are being sort of sneaky and clever, because they're making it sound like, You should be the person that's voting, and not somebody else, when we know it's a non-existent problem. But obviously, you've laid it all out. It's as clear as day what's going on here. But are they going to make this case?
Well, we will see, right? I mean, this Republicans have majorities in all of these houses. And the question becomes whether they are willing to break the filibuster to move ahead and try and enact this. That has not worked thus far, right? They have passed various forms of these acts in this Congress already, and they have largely failed in the Senate. Already, we are seeing Senator Murkowski from Alaska saying she's not going to support this in this form. So I don't know if they will be able to get to 51 votes, let alone 60. Democrats remain unanimously opposed. In the Senate, you had a handful of Democrats in the House that were on board with this legislation previously. Cuellar from Texas, Golden from Maine. I believe there were four of them in all. Unclear where they stand right now. I continue to think that this legislation is a real long shot to pass. I don't think that enough Republicans in the Senate will be willing to blow up the filibuster over it, but it certainly seems to be moving with a speed and momentum that I think a lot of people did not anticipate.
Well, the Republicans must know that, in fact, they making it clear that they'd rather cheat than compete. They know that they can't win on a level playing field, particularly now with the public turning against ICE and the economy going sour and Trump losing his mind. There's lots of reasons why they're in huge trouble, and every off-year by-election that happens, the Democrats win in red states by massive, surprising margins. So this is shaping up to be a blowout, isn't it? So aren't they desperate? And aren't they likely to do anything and everything?
Well, I think it's really important to connect the dots between everything that's happening right now, right? Donald Trump going on conservative podcasts and saying he wants to federalize elections, specifically saying he wants to take over elections in, at least 15 places, to connect the dots with what's happening in Atlanta, in Fulton County, where they've gone in and seized voting machines and ballots and other items from the 2020 election, and what looks to be an effort to try and claim some kind of national security fig leaf to step in there, or to bring the conservative state election board in charge of elections in Atlanta. Certainly what we're seeing in Minneapolis would be, a fairly frightful dry run for what could be done in Detroit or Philadelphia or Milwaukee or,
Mm,
Charlotte, other
right.
cities on election day in 20.
Which is what Steve Bannon is
Yes.
promising, right?
Yeah, so if you put all of this together along with these bills, certainly it looks as if this is a political party that's willing to do just about anything to try to stay in power. I don't think they'll be successful with these efforts. These efforts are still very, very difficult to pull off, not only because of the filibuster, but because, I don't think ICE has enough troops to cause that kind of chaos in that many American cities. The elections that have been held in Minneapolis, even this year, people were still willing to show up. But this kind of chaos and intimidation is un-American, and it cannot stand.
So just in closing, though, Senator Murkowski, who's opposing this SAVE Act, basically said, look, this is a state matter. The founding fathers, the 13 colonies, that was their first insistence. Before joining the Union, they insisted that the states control the elections. This is as old as the American Constitution itself, isn't it?
Yes, we have a very defederalized system of elections. Our elections are run at the state level, at the precinct level, in some ways. And so, Donald Trump cannot, step in and take this over. I do not think he would be successful. It would also, be a massive outlay of federal dollars. This would be a huge unfunded mandate. What is being talked about here? It's massive federal overreach, which is usually the kind of thing that
Right.
conservatives stood against.
Right. You wonder, though, how brain dead is huge parts of this country not to recognize that the guy that wants to rig the vote and says that the vote is unsafe is the guy that conducted a coup against the Constitution and against the vote in 2020. And this guy could not be more discredited. And yet he's the one that's calling for the votes in this country to be nationalized. It is
Call is coming from inside the house.
It's just so disgraceful, and I lament at the fact that anybody in this country supports this guy because he's so manifestly corrupt. But I guess that's what we have, and I thank you for joining us.
A pleasure. Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with David Daley, who's the author of Anti-Democratic: Inside the Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, as well as the national bestseller Rat Eft, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for kickstarting the national movement to reform redistricting. He's the former editor-in-chief of Salon, and his journalism appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Atlantic, among other publications. We're going to take a brief station break and back with the author of a new book just out, Fighting Oligarchy: How Positive Populism Can Reclaim America.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe. Our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Charles Derber, a professor of sociology at Boston College, a lifelong social justice activist. His work focuses on the crises of capitalism, globalism, corporate power, militarism, the culture of hegemony, the climate crisis, and peace and global justice movements. His recent books include Turnout, Mobilizing Voters in an Emergency, Dying for Capitalism, How Big Money Fuels Extinction, and What We Can Do About It, How We Win, Energizing Strategies, Voters and Agendas, and Bonfire, American Sociocide, Broken Relations, and the Quest for Democracy. His latest book just out is Fighting Oligarchy: How Positive Populism Can Reclaim America. Welcome to Background Briefing, Charles Derber.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us, Charles. So let's start with positive populism. I guess that's defined, negative populism would be Donald Trump, right? This phony guy that's pretended to be a populist but is serving the interests of the billionaire class, which he's desperately grifting to belong to. He's made, something like $5 billion out of his second presidency already.
Right. But I think the reason I use the term positive populism is that most people, when they hear the word populism, I've asked people about this. I ask students about this in my classes, and they have a negative association with the term populism, which I sort of understand. Like, populism is kind of a bad word in America because it sort of evokes the idea of a raging mob of people sort of just yelling and screaming and angry and likely to be wanting to tear things down. And so part of this book I wrote because I think we're in a period of time when some kind of populism is absolutely destined to rule the country. When when we move into very hard economic times, like most people are experiencing today, mainstream parties are just not going to cut it. People want real change because they're feeling terrible. And so that can be either the kind of populism that you described that Trump offers, which is kind of a long history of far-right populism, which sounds like it's for the workers and against the establishment, but is actually, as you suggested, as people sort of know, is largely aligned with the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses and all the very wealthy people who are running this country. But there is a tradition of a more democratic kind of populism. And I just want to highlight that when I say positive populism, because I think people turn off from the word. And I think we've buried a lot of the history of positive populist movements that show what they can do and why they're really essential to building democracy. And I think the Democratic Party has lost a lot of that history, and people who vote Democratic or don't vote just don't really understand what it would mean to have a kind of populism that would really work for ordinary people. So that's really why I wrote the book. Sort of say there is a history. It's really important to know that history and what it would look like today.
So let's look at the history then. I guess the last time you had a populist presidential candidate was when the Democratic Party ran William Jennings Bryan against the Oligarchy's candidate McKinley, who, needless to say, Trump's a huge admirer of him. Of course, McKinley was assassinated shortly after winning. McKinley and the Republicans outspent the Democrats, I think, 80-1 in that election at the end of the 19th century. But what William Jennings Bryan, of course, he's remembered as for the Scopes trial, where he was he was railing against evolution. In those days, there was a populist movement of the urban poor and the rural poor. And what happened?
Mostly rural, yes. But that's a really important history, Ian. I agree. I'll just say one thing. There is a more recent kind of left populism, but that emerged both in the New Deal, a kind of progressive populism in the New Deal, which we can talk about, and also in the 60s, which was part of the generation that I grew up with in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. But just to go back, you're mentioning a really important part of history, which I think most people know very little about, which is the populist movement of the 1890s. Because there you had, they were dealing there with their own first Gilded Age, with these incredibly rich people like Rockefeller, who became the country's first billionaire in 1890, when about 90% of the country was poor. And you had people like J.P. Morgan and Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, and Vanderbilt, and so forth. And they were basically doing what our oligarchs are doing today. They were running the country and making the lives of ordinary people really, really hard. And of course, in this period of history, we're talking about 150 years ago, most people were farmers. There was sort of an emerging immigrant industrial class. But, the populists did exhibit some of the elements of what I call positive populism. So these were farmers. I love the way they organized, Ian. They lived in villages, mostly in the Midwest. They were around the South. So they were often culturally conservative folks, working people that, progressives have given up on today. But it's important to realize that they were able to, I love the way they organized. It had a populist flavor. It was village by village. They had a bunch of rotating sort of speakers and lecturers who were basically just ordinary people talking about the difficulties that people of that period were having under the rule of the Wall Street crowd under Morgan and Rockefeller and so forth. And in 1892, they put out a declaration, which I suspect none of your listeners have heard about in school, which was called the Omaha Declaration, which was a proclamation that ordinary people like themselves, farmers, working class people, should rise up and take control of Wall Street and of the corporations. And this was brought together mostly farmers, but there were some urban workers. There were some progressive unions at that point, run by people like Eugene Debs, who later went to jail in World War I against the fighting against World War I. But the reason I'm glad you mentioned this, Ian, is that if I had to pick a period of history where people could go back and learn a little bit about what it would be like to really build a movement today. I mean, I think we have an important movement today, but I think that movement can learn a lot from the early populists. And William Jennings Bryan was one of the leaders. They helped found a new party called the People's Party in 1892. And their agenda was basically to have ordinary people take over Wall Street, take over ownership of most of the big banks, which were charging really high interest rates, and of the big corporations. And it was just a very radical program developed by very ordinary farmers and workers. And, William Jennings Bryan, who you mentioned, did lead the party, but he watered down a lot of what happened was that the People's Party got absorbed in the Democratic Party. And in the race against McKinley in 1896, the People's Party, which had been this radical, positive, populist party, got absorbed by a much more conservative Democratic Party. And William Jennings Bryan, who you might say is one of the first leading populists, sort of sold the populists out. He really pulled away. He ran on a campaign called Silver, sort of moving from just the gold standard to silver to loosen up currency. But it really lost the kind of radical edge that the populist movement represented. So Bryan, I'm not surprised that, when people hear Bryan, they think about the Scopes trial and his, he moved in a very different direction. But, there are more recent historical movements. I mean, the New Deal. Ian, do you think of the New Deal as populist?
Absolutely. And let me just, on that note, Charles, read from FDR's Second Bill of Rights, which was one of the last speeches that he made. He called for a new Bill of Rights, and among these are the right to a useful, remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return that will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home and abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness and accidents and unemployment, the right to a good education. What's wrong with that?
I'm so glad you read that. That's great, Ian, because it's so relevant today. And, FDR, he was the only president who served 4 terms, who was elected 4 terms. And of course, there was a massive depression. But, those words you read are very, very important because everything you read speaks to ordinary people today. Healthcare, basic income that will support a viable, life is disappearing. For about 60% of Americans say they live paycheck to paycheck. One sickness, one loss of job is going to throw them into poverty. And, we have a small number of people who are doing, the markets are high and are prospering with, high stock valuations. But the vast majority of people do not have stock. And, the rich people who are doing really well, that are part of Trump's administration, these people in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street and so forth, they are, it's about 800 billionaires have more wealth than most of the country combined. In fact, 3 billionaires have more wealth than about 50% of the country. We have an incredibly concentrated capital. In the Depression in the 30s, we got a movement which I would say is positive populism, because what is positive populism? It's sort of what you read. It takes seriously the idea that ordinary people should run the country, both the economy so that they can afford to live a decent life, and the governments, because you need government to be able to make sure that wages are fine, that that rich people are being taxed fairly and so forth. So, the experience of the Depression also brought together, sort of like the resistance on the streets against Trump today, a very wide variety of people. You had workers, of course, right at the center of it, but you had people of, you had men and women, you have different religious backgrounds. There was still some racial tension, but it was a movement that took seriously with the words you read, the idea that the country is being run by an elite, a group of people with a lot of money. And as long as that's the case, we can't have a real democracy and we can't have a quality of life that really is meaningful and healthy for most people. So I think the New Deal, and I raise this just because I don't know if you know this, you have the same experience, Ian, but when I talk to liberal friends, who are not necessarily, I mean, they're progressive and they vote Democratic, but when I say use the word populism, they sort of shy away very often, either because they have this negative view that this is a demagogic, revolutionary, angry movement that's going to lead to its own dictatorship on the left or something, or it's going to lead to Trump. And what I found when I wrote this book, which is called Fighting Oligarchy, which is often confused with Bernie Sanders' book, Fight Oligarchy. I named my book a little bit before. He and I are, however, pretty much on the same page, although our books do somewhat different things. Since mine has a lot more history and it sort of builds into this positive populist idea through the kind of conversation that we're having about American history. But I find, I don't know if you find this, Ian, but many of my friends shy away from the idea that we can build a kind of politics other than just moving up against Trump. To try to stand up for something new and different in America sounds like we're going to lose to a lot of people. In other words, they don't have faith. I mean, as you said, Trump won because he promised to shake up this terrible system we were in. He sounded like a populist. He's governing absolutely like a corporate oligarch. His trick was to persuade people that as a billionaire, he was going to help out the working people and throw out these very wealthy people who were running the country for their own purposes. He, of course, didn't do what he promised, but people voted for him. And one of the things I've noticed, and I begin the book with, is showing that most ordinary people, including grassroots Republicans, are really populist. And by that, I mean, they really are extremely angry at big companies. About 72% of Americans over several recent years consistently say that they feel more negatively about big companies and the power that they exercise than any other institution. If you ask people to rank which American institutions they trust government, local communities, the military, everything but big banks and big companies. And those are down. They like labor unions a lot. About 70% say we really desperately need a labor movement. And this includes, by the way, high super majorities of Republicans. And this is true around, I have a lot of data early on. The book is written in a very simple way to read, but the numbers are really amazing because the majority of Republicans, ordinary Republicans who are, Trump's base, working class people, they voice incredible anger against these big companies. Like I say, one of the biggest polling things in terms of people's attitudes is that Republicans have moved very, very heavily against Trump and the corporations because they've seen Trump sort of break his promises and move away from what he promised to do, which was to shake up this corporate system that we're living under. So I think the most important thing that comes out of this is that if you look carefully, my friends who are skeptical about this say, look, ordinary people, non-college working people, they're culturally conservative. They may be religious. They may be anti-abortion. They may be anti-immigrant or anti-Black or anti-brown. And, there's some truth to that. There is cultural conservatism in the working classes. If we go all the way back for a minute to the populist movement in the 1890s that you referenced right at the beginning of our conversation, Ian, that included people in the Midwest and South who were culturally conservative. And the reason I think that history is important is it demonstrated that a populist transformative movement can attract culturally conservative people. You don't have to be a cosmopolitan, secular Marxist to embrace this kind of movement that says the country is being run by a small group of people who are essentially undermining the life prospects of almost everybody in the society. And culturally conservative workers now believe that. It's really, really clear. And so when I talk to my friends, I have to sort of let them see this day. They say, well, I can't believe that these culturally conservative non-college people are going to support the kind of ideas you're talking about. But right in my first chapter of the book, I show, okay, it surprised me when I looked at the polls. And like I said, this is a lot of polling of Republicans by Republican pollsters. And they're showing a very, very pronounced rise, a supermajority of Republicans saying that they are against big corporations. They want to see the rise of working class organizations like unions. They like unions, and they hate corporations more than any other institution in America. So there's like a groundswell of kind of populist fever in the country. And it's not surprising, because when people are not doing well economically, when they're having hard times, it's inevitable that they're going to be populist. Real populism, as you kind of hinted at the beginning, Ian, is ordinary people rising up sort of in anguish and anger about their life circumstances. They're not feeling things are going well, and they feel like this is not an accident. They feel the country is being structured in a way, is organized to absolutely benefit the very wealthy people who control much of our economy and much of our government, and that they don't have a chance. They don't feel they have a chance. That's going to lead to populism of one kind or another. A party, any kind of politician who runs on mainstream ideas of just do a little tinkering here and there is going to lose those people. Trump won because he was perceived as having he was going to really shake up this frigging institution. He was going to mess with the power structure, and he said he was going to help ordinary Americans. Now, as you said right at the beginning, it was a lie. Most of us knew it would probably be a lie if we know Trump's long history as in his own billionaire status. But ordinary Americans believed him. And it's taken, a second term now, and also the collapse of any kind of real Democratic Party populism to reelect Trump. I mean, the Democrats set Trump up for another win. When Kamala Harris, this is true of both Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. They ran as establishment people. What I mean by that is, yes, their identity was female, and people of color in the case of Kamala Harris. But, she often said, I'm a proud capitalist. She took a lot of her money from her friends in Silicon Valley up in near San Francisco, where she's from. And she basically ran in the safe cocoon of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. And, really since Roosevelt, which is why you think it's relevant, and a little bit of LBJ during the 60s, the Democratic Party has abandoned populism, and it's turned it over to far right. Like, people have been in trouble economically. They're really hurting. There's just no doubt about it. It happened in the Depression. It happened in the 70s and 80s because the Democrats abandoned even the New Deal form of populism. The biggest thing that happened, it's the earthquake in American politics, is that ordinary people who are pissed off as hell and want real change, they gravitated to the Republicans. For the last 40 years, non-college, ordinary working people are gravitating from the New Deal Democrats to the Republican Party because they hear populist refrain in the words of, the far right Christian movements and the kind of populists of there's a really interesting history of far right populism, just like there is of left populism, that goes back to the America First movement in the 30s that was very pro-Nazi, but also very pro-worker in the way they railed against American corporations hurting workers in the Depression. There's this really odd thing of, claiming that the corporations, this happened with the John Birch Society and Goldwater in the 60s, that these far-right populists sort of emerged to claim that big corporations were Marxist and going global, and they were going to restore, with a dictatorship, restore the country to the workers. But they were really speaking for workers. The Democrats were able to effectively, work against that as long as they had their own form of populism that you read in FDR's words, that people felt, yeah, this guy is really going to help me in terms of my basic economic situation. After the New Deal, the Democrats floated into this, and Bill Clinton was the critical, pivotal figure here, although Jimmy Carter was part of it too. You had a big stagflation of the late 70s. The Vietnam War caused a lot of havoc with the dollar and American position in the world. And things went south economically. What did the Democratic Party do? It didn't renew the sort of economic, appeal and promise that brought workers into the Democratic Party in the 30s. It went to identity politics. It went to saying, we are the party of women, blacks, and it sort of embraced identity politics and abandoned the idea of any kind of class-based or economically based politics. And, I'm a big believer in the importance of race and gender, but the interesting thing about positive populist movements is they're much more effective than actually what I call siloed identity politics, which focus purely on race as an isolated issue or gender as an isolated issue. I mean, blacks do a lot better when they're aligned with whites around shared economic issues. The same is true of women. Under Obama, if you voted for Obama as a black person, the wealth gap between blacks and whites expanded under Obama. Obama basically fell into the trap that Bill Clinton set, which was to bring the Democratic Party from some kind of language and agenda that could really speak to the great majority of people. Remember, over 60% of Americans don't go to college. That number is increasing. They are getting really terrible wages. Their health care and their education, wages in the United States are much lower than in Europe, which are less well off than the United States. And they don't have the health care protection or the educational option that European workers have. So we are really a weird country because for the majority of people, we don't offer the basic rights that you read from Roosevelt.
From FDR. Charles, unfortunately, we've run out of time. And we haven't really gotten into how positive populism can reclaim America, which means people have to read your book.
Yeah. Well, yes.
But let me just quickly segue now into pitching the book. But since we're offering up your book as a gift in support of Background Briefing and KPFK in Los Angeles and KPFA in the San Francisco Bay Area, in the last minute or so, Charles Derber, can you tell our audience how important your book is, and particularly how positive populism can reclaim America from the oligarchs?
Well, thank you, Ian. So the book is called Fighting Oligarchy. And the subtitle is How Positive Populism Can Reclaim America. And really the book, it's written, I'm an academic, but I'm an activist, and I try to write in very personal and very clear ways. So I think anybody, including non-college people, can read this book. Anybody who's gone to high school can read this book. And I think it gives a new perspective on what's gone wrong in the country, on how the Democratic Party has sold out the ordinary person in the country, and what kind of movements that we're beginning to see on the streets today, how they bring together instincts of political democracy with economic needs that are very central to remember, 60% of Americans are feeling desperate. Their economic situation is really, really dire. So what the book does, it tries to show in very clear, simple language how we've lost the historical tradition of politics that has always spoken to the needs of ordinary working people, but has also been able to integrate and unify, students, feminists, civil rights workers. I cut my teeth in Mississippi organizing for Black people. I don't in going away from identity politics, it's partly because my history teaches me that the interests of people when they come together across race and gender and class, and really share a common set of basic rights and needs that they all share, you get much more progress on all the fundamentals, certainly on the economy. You cannot win in America today when things are so difficult economically without promising that you're going to shake up this economic system in a really fundamental way, just like Roosevelt promised to do, and like the populists 150 years ago did do. So I sort of spell that out and look at the way the current resistance, including the most recent in Minneapolis and on streets around the country, how a populist movement is being built in this resistance and how it needs to emerge and change. And by the way, this populism has to go beyond Trump, because if we just overthrow Trump, we're going to go back to the corporate oligarchy that prevailed under Trump and before him, and that will reemerge if you just simply get rid of Trump and go back to what happened before. So this book is also an argument about what the resistance has to do to, I call it regime change at home. You got to defeat Trump. That's absolutely essential. But you can't defeat Trump, and you can't stop another Trump from coming in until you've made much more fundamental changes. Trump came in because of pre-existing, conditions that were so desperate for ordinary people. They're going to resurface until we get a positive movement that really reclaims the country for ordinary people. So I really do hope. I've written lots and lots of books, like my 30th book, but I think this one is really important for people who are not feeling like the country is working for them right now, and what it would mean to change the country, how that's happening, how it's beginning to happen, that can really make a difference.
Well, Charles Derber, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much for having me, and I appreciate it a lot.
And again, I've been speaking with Charles Derber, who's a professor of sociology at Boston College, a lifelong social justice activist. His work focuses on the crises of capitalism, globalization, corporate power, militarism, the culture of hegemony, the climate crisis, and peace and global justice movements. And his books include How We Win, Energizing Strategies, Voters and Agendas, and Bonfire, American Sociocide, Broken Relations and the Quest for Democracy. And his latest book, just out, is Fighting Oligarchy, How Positive Populism Can Reclaim America. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org. where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes out.